Welcome, Shiamin Kwa from Bryn Mawr University, professor in East Asian languages and cultures, as well as comparative literature. Welcome.
Thank you. It's so nice to be virtually here.
I am so excited that I get to spend a little bit of time with you and others to talk to you about your incredible work. You have so many incredible interests and you've done so much great sort of writing and research in areas of comics and adaptation and translation and global circulation of text. And my goodness, like, I don't know, the world, the sky is definitely not the limit for you. But there's got to be an origin story, I'm sure, or something here, right? Why? I know you've published on Mulan and on Chinese drama and so on, but why comics?
Well, comics, I think, is sort of a natural link to my other interests that I started with in my studies. I was an English major in college, and then I actually studied, as you mentioned, classical Chinese literature. That's what I have my PhD in. But even in that research, even though it's in 16th and 17th century Chinese literature, I was interested in opera. And so for me, I always was drawn to multidisciplinary kinds of projects that had very strong visual aspects, the kinds of things that words don't always capture, both music, but also movement and visuals. And so I was, and I guess I've been an avid comics reader, more, Sunday comics or Mad Magazine or something like that. But it was a very natural transition for me, and I wrote about it a little bit in the introduction to my book. I had moved to Texas for a few years, and I sort of needed a break from my research, and I started reading a lot of comics, like alternative comics, and it just suddenly became a potential field of scholarship for me, and it kind of gradually grew. And I happened to be working at Bryn Mawr, which is very open to those interdisciplinary kinds of projects, and I just went with it.
You have your book on Mulan, and which is, I think, fascinating, because I think most of the mainstream think of Mulan as only the kind of Disney story.
Sure. Yeah.
But in a way, that's kind of pop culture, right? Pop culture in China. So can you, maybe that's a nice way to kind of weave this together with, the current work that you're doing. Yeah.
Sure. One of the plays that I wrote about in my dissertation was actually a 16th century adaptation of Mulan. And in fact, that was, over 1,000 years after the first mention of Mulan in Chinese literature. And the thing that I was really interested in is the way that a story sort of has its life by other people contributing to it, right? So it's not about keeping as close as possible to some original story, but instead a way of thinking through current events or thinking through an author's specific interests, but by applying those thoughts and interests to the same story structure. And the book therefore kind of goes through different versions of the Mulan story in 2 poems, and then in these 2 plays, and then in a movie script, and thinks about what things stay the same and what changes are made, maybe because of the genre, whether it's a film or an opera, and also what kinds of interests the audiences have. And so that is, as you said, a natural movement into some of the work that I've done on comics as well.
And if you were to characterize your work or interests, your kind of worldview, say,
Mm-hmm.
in your approach to comics, because there's so many different ways, right? We could focus on reader response or the formal aspects or comic book history. What would you say kind of characterizes your interest or your drive?
I think I'm very much informed by sort of formalist close readings of texts. And I think actually one of the things that I said when I was writing regarding frames was that I wanted to write about comics in the same way that Helen Vendler writes about poetry, that, she sort of, it's just this very intense, close reading of the text, and thinking about the ways that the author has used the form itself to comment on the content. And I think that's the approach that I've used no matter what I've been writing about, whether it's a 16th century play or a comic from last year.
So, speaking of regarding frames, tell us why the frame is so important in comics.
I think for me anyway, I think the sense of structure is has always been sort of the most compelling the most compelling way of putting thoughts and emotions into a form that can be shared with others. And that's been my own experience in writing an essay. And, I sort of like to have an outline worked out. And by the time I actually write my essay, it's already written because I have it all plotted out. And so I think I am drawn to works where I feel like the author or the artist is doing the same thing, right? Like maybe not even in a conscious way, but in a way where I can see the design in it, and I see how it is relating to the actual content. I actually, what got me really started with it was Michael DeForge's book Ant Colony, which was published in 2014. And it's kind of a meaty text with lots of subplots. But the thing about it that made me suddenly think, I want to write about this book was when I was reading it, discovering that in the very middle of the book, there was this an X kind of made by a magnifying glass, and it was in the very center of the book, so that it sort of visually made the book separated into two halves and moving outwards in one direction in both halves of the book. And in fact, I was so compelled by this, I sent him an email and said, did you do this on purpose? And he never really answered that question, but to me it almost didn't matter because the structure itself was evident in the text, and it sort of directed my reading of it. So that's.
So tell me, maybe either walk us through one of these images here that I've taken from your book. But
sure.
What is, people talk about comics, the kind of baseline comic kind of sentence as a sequence of panels. Some people say no, it's the sequence of panels, but it's the page and it's sequence. And I mean, obviously you can only have a sequence if you have kind of clearly defined kind of time space units of the frame, right? So yeah,
Yeah.
tell me like in a nutshell, like how am I supposed to read some of this, and why is the frame so important to us?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think actually that's part of the argument of my book, is that the frame is so important to all of these different artists, and yet they all use it in very different ways. And, you know, for example, when you talk about sequence and movement between frames, I find that to be extremely easy to talk about when talking about something like Kevin Huizenga's work, which is the one in the upper right hand corner of the slide. You know, there's something very rhythmic and almost musical about the way that he uses these frames, and that the movement between the frames is more or less linked to the shape of the frame. And so the sequence of imagery is, in this case, this is a video game, a representation of a video game, which is in many ways also an allegory of a relationship that's going badly. The reader is sort of guided through time very carefully between the frames. But when I'm talking about frames in, for example, the larger image of the 6 cells that is by Gabrielle Bell, this is part of her daily diary effort. And so although the frames, formally capture the passage of time, they also, I think, are very interesting because of the way that each frame, almost all of the frames of her comics have her in them. And when you see them printed on the page, or you see them in the actual original drawings, they're about the size of a passport photo. And it's interesting to think about the way that the hand-drawn self-portrait is a challenge to this idea of the passport photo, right? Like that some one image of a person can fix their identity, because her comics are about change and about the kinds of transformations that we all go through day to day. And we see that in the way that she shows herself in each of these panels. And so, you know, each of these artists is working with the same conventions and the same structures, but in very sort of strikingly different ways. But they're relying on us knowing about this vocabulary, right? That something's changing between the frames. But what changes is often very different.
Yeah, really. Thank you for those insights. It's interesting that you have with Bell this the frame that becomes a kind of box that pushes, almost creates some tension between the visuals and the textual elements, right? And you know, the sense of like even the diminished presence of the visual, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it's often the case that she draws people looking at frames, whether it's windows with people that, you know, whether they're watching other people through windows, or people in another apartment, or she just did a comic recently of a framed piece of her own work that she was transporting. So it's you know, it's something that is absolutely striking, right? That this idea of these kinds of formal constraints that we work with, and that there's a great deal of beauty to be had from struggling against that.
Yeah,
Way.
beautiful. Yeah, how the constraints can and does create, actually, right? Becomes a space of creation. So yeah, can you talk a little bit about your work on space and memory in comics? And I'm thinking in particular here, your work for the volume that's forthcoming with Routledge on gender and sexuality in comic.
Yeah, I'm so excited for that.
Yeah, oh my goodness, I am too.
It looks beautiful. Congratulations. Well, so this book is Emil Ferris says my favorite thing is monsters, which is still only halfway published because we're still waiting for volume 2. You know, this book was on the New York Times bestseller list, and I think it's really path-breaking in so many ways. And one of the things that it does that I think is so fascinating is it shows us how willing we are to jump back and forth in time, even, you know, through this kind of hybrid protagonist of a werewolf girl who's telling a story about the Holocaust, which is something that she doesn't really know about, but that she's able to enter through another person's voice. I'm very interested in memory and space, and actually it links back to the 16th century in China, because the Jesuits, who were missionaries in China at this time, had a method of memory making, which was, in order to memorize something, they would teach their students to imagine a place in their mind and walk through it, right? And by being able to visualize a physical room or a house and put various objects in that room, people were supposed to be able to link the things that they needed to keep memorized with those objects that were created in their memory. And you know, this may sound kind of esoteric and strange, but I think it's really relevant to the way that we think about why we memorialize spaces, what it means to return to your old house that other people are living in now, or, you know, to an old theater, like the kinds of sites that Ferris puts in her book, that, you know, maybe it used to be this grand theater in the 1920s, and now it's a drugstore or a Target or something, and yet it's still infused with memory, and because of those memories of specific people, it has this kind of profound meaning. So, you know, looking at something on Google Maps is not the same thing as hearing a narrative related to a specific site, right? With even if it has the same coordinates, it has a different kind of meaning. So that was what I was trying to pursue.
Well, it's brilliant, and I'm so glad you were able to do that for the volume.
Thank you.
You know, it is interesting. It brings up all sorts of issues about who has the right to kind of connect spatially with objects, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, genocide, a big part of acts of genocide is actually controlling and even erasing
That's right.
entire populations' ability to memorialize, right? To
Yeah.
spatialize memory.
Yeah. And that's been something that I've, you know, I found so fascinating about spaces, that for precisely that reason, right? That people can be in a physical place and not know what all of the things that have happened there, and that we rely on these narratives, we rely on the oral histories and history in general to keep those things alive.
Oh, so important, this work. And then, of course, very much kind of part of your formal drive drive to kind of excavate and enrich our understanding of the formal aspects of comics, but comics in a very different shape here, right?
Yeah, so this comic by Emil Homewood, who's a Tokyo-based artist, is very, very short, and it's really just, it's like a joke. In fact, I think we were so lucky that we were able to reproduce the whole comic in the volume, and I think the online version has it in color, so that's really exciting. This comic I find so compelling because it is something that all of us who have smartphones can relate to entirely, which is that our smartphones will autocorrect us, or people will send something in haste, and it's just garbled, and we read it, and sometimes we get it immediately, and sometimes we read meaning into things that we shouldn't. Sort of anecdotally, I had just sent a friend a text the other night to wish her a happy Passover, and I got a reply from her that just said no. And so I thought, okay. And about 20 minutes later, she wrote me back and she said, I'm so sorry. I think my Apple Watch just automatically replied to your text message. And you know, it's like those kinds of things happen so frequently in our day that we don't even challenge them or think about them. And Homewood's comic really draws our attention to it because it's a text message conversation between two people who don't see each other, and they're having a conversation which by the end of the comic we realize is completely one-sided. But as we progress through reading the comic with her, and I actually read this with my students in class, we all sort of try to make sense of all of the garbled letters, because we send those kinds of messages to each other all the time, right? OMG, JK, and you know, my son will write things like IDK or, you know, LMK, and we sort of process it and we make language and meaning out of it. But then sometimes we get it completely wrong because somebody just accidentally sent something. So this comic plays on that, and I wanted to address how making a comic about a digital conversation could especially draw our attention to it.
Are there digital comics on, like, purposely made? I know in Korea they have those now that you kind
where
of
you have to scroll through them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Actually, one of my students who's from China wrote a really great essay about a Chinese comics maker who just does these kinds of scrolling web comics, and how, because of his success, they actually published hard copies of it, and it's a completely different reading experience. And so she wrote a paper about the conflict between the forms, right? That it's not just the images that make the comic; it's actually how you interact with the text and in the form that it was made in. So yeah, it's really interesting. I'm not so good at reading things online because I think from a generation that likes to hold paper in the hand, but I do read a lot of text messages. So
yes, right, yes, that's true. And it is always nice. Always, no matter what, I will, you know, go to the printed copy. I can read it fine on my computer, but if I really want to read it, like, you know, then I print it.
Yeah, I feel like I have to read with a pen in my hand, you know, like even if I'm not writing on it, I like to have the feeling
totally there. And so speaking of your students, let's talk about you are an award-winning professor. Can you share some of your methods for teaching comics?
Sure. Well, I mean, one of the things I actually try a lot of different things in classes. I've had the good luck of having an institution that's very supportive of creative kinds of activities. So even in my classes that are not about comics, I've been able to sneak in some comics. So when I teach Introduction to Chinese Literature, and we're reading poetry from the 8th century, which is very formally structured. It has lots of parallelisms, it has a lot of rhymes. I have my students illustrate it, and you know, because they're very short, they can make one panel for each line of the poem, and it really helps them see what the thought processes were for the poet, you know, in the 8th century, who's trying to have a parallel structure throughout the poem. So one line will have the sun rising, and the second line will have the sun setting, or one line will have mountains in the distance, and the second line will have something, a leaf or a blossom close to their face. And sometimes when you're reading a poem, these things just, you know, you may notice them, but they go away very quickly. But if you're forced to draw what you're supposed to see in the poem, you suddenly realize why the things are placed there. So that's one example of bringing comics into a non-comics classroom. And then we do it the opposite way in my comics classrooms, like where I said, you know, we read Emil Holmwood's comic aloud, you know, and we go around the room and each student has to read the panel out loud to the class. And it's really great because you can see how one person is reading the panel, and then it becomes really collaborative because everyone starts saying, oh, and what about this thing? And it becomes very organically a group project of reading, which is lovely, and I'm lucky that I have these opportunities to workshop through reading like that.
Yeah, in fact, in many ways, we can think of kind of going back to your frames, systems of framing, as a kind of decision to segment in the same way that we might segment a poem with a line break, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. You're right. I mean, I think it's maybe I have this like tunnel vision that I'm applying to everything, where I think, let's break this down into the smallest unit, and then let's compare these units and see how they're kind of balancing against each other, how they're fighting. Yeah.
Love that.
It's true.
So, Shiamin, what is exciting for you in the world of comics today?
I mean, what isn't exciting? I think it's the most compelling form that I've encountered in, you know, the last decade or more, right? I feel like the most fascinating, most daring works are being created in this hybrid form, and it's amazing to me that people, you know, have this kind of crystal clear way of storytelling, and then they're able to execute it with their incredible artistic skill. And I'm just bowled over by this, and it's also really exciting to be talking to artists now, and to see the way that they are so receptive to each other's ideas and supportive. I mean, I really love this culture of sharing and support, and just, you know, amazing work. I mean, I think, you know, my next project on comics is about reproduction. Actually, it's about the way that we look at the comics form as a kind of this reproducible work of art, and that democratic way of sharing work and not really fixating on having some original work. I mean, we do like original pages, and we, you know, go to museums sometimes and look at them on display, but really the comic is made for this kind of mass dispersal, and I find that such a beautiful aspect of the comic. So everything excites me about comics.
Oh my goodness, yes. And this is the year you have your American Philosophical Society fellowship. And, yes, we have, goodness, the whole planet is kind of on lockdown. But God, I really hope that you're able to get some work done on this new book of yours for comic studies. And yeah,
Yeah.
so gosh, Shiamin, thank you so much for joining me to share your passion, your research on comics.
Thanks. It was so much fun.